Okay.
So, where shall we begin? Well, I've been asking everyone why they first started coming to the football, but for you, it's a slightly different reason than other people. Lots of people say they first came with their dad. You kind of came because of your dad.
Yes.
I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about your early experiences of Exeter City Football Club.
Yeah, certainly. I started coming here from the age of about 2.5 to 3. I used to sit on Mum's knee. Mum had a regular seat in the grandstand, and she used to sit next to an old ardent City fan called Headley. And he was always very vocal and very loud, and he used to terrify me as a little boy. But she used to bring me up to nearly every home game, and I can always remember as I grew up and got a bit older, I got a bit bolder. I used to run down to the railings here when the players used to run out, at the start of the game, and also come off at half-time. I used to run down and shout, "Daddy, Daddy." Didn't really know or appreciate what was going on at the time, and my sort of recollections started then from that early age, sitting in this old wooden grandstand with wooden sort of slatted seats. And I can always remember there was a press box at the top, which I believe was enclosed, and that's where the guys from the Echo and the Western Morning News used to sit. And you could always hear the typewriters going in the background. But as I grew older, I used to come with my grandfather, but I became a season ticket holder in sort of 66, 67 season. But we couldn't afford a season ticket for the grandstand, so we used to stand in the corners, always on the angles, normally down by the old railwayman's stand on the big bank right in the corner, because I used to think it afforded you the best view of the pitch. But as I grew into my teens, my grandfather bought me a season ticket, and we used to sit in the grandstand. I used to sit with my grandfather and had many fond recollections of games. I remember the Sheffield Wednesday game in the League Cup, where I believe Dermot Curtis scored 2 goals, and I remember him chipping Ron Springett, who was then an England goalkeeper, at the St James Road end. And the treat for me was always a cup of OXO at half time, because it was always very salty, and I always remember that as a kiddie, as a young teenager. And then latterly after that, I used to come up with my school pals, and we used to stand on the big bank, and it's where I had my first cigarette. Stood on the big bank, menthol cigarette, so that Dad couldn't smell it when I got home. So, but my first recollections were sitting on my mother's knee up here from about the age of 2.5 to 3. But I always remember Headley, and he was very vocal, as I say, and just used to frighten me to death. And I think I used to cry, and Mother had to calm me down. But as I say, I can always remember the old railings at the front, the old metal railings they had all around the ground, and used to run down and put your hands through and try and touch Dad, etc., etc. So Mother's family were Exeter City fans from an early age, and I think her uncle came up here. I think it was the 4th game they ever played up here against Norwich City, and we've got a postcard where he sat or stood in the front row with his flat cap on, and of course in those days everybody wore flat caps, even from an early age. And to say she was weaned on it as well. I mean, she came up here from the age of 6, 7 years of age with all her school friends, and she never left it. And she met my father through coming to watch here, and then when he lived in Diggs in Pennow Road, she used to see him walking to work, walking to his place of business, which was here at St James Park.
Fantastic. Now, being the son of the captain, prominent player of the football club, did you have privileged access to underneath the grandstand? Yeah,
very much so. I can remember going into the old dressing rooms, and there was always a big a pot of tea on the table in the dressing room. It always used to smell of liniment. It used to stink of liniment, and also things like, you'd always used to see bits of bandage on the floor, because they used to tie up their socks, their stockings with bits of bandage. And I can always remember seeing them strewn across the floor, especially at the end of the game when they'd taken their socks off. And Dad always used to chew a lot of gum. He favoured Dentine chewing gum as opposed to Wrigley's. And I can always remember he always had sticks of Dentine at home. And it's quite a distinctive smell. It's like a red, thin piece of gum. And he used to make a piece of chewing gum last him the full 90 minutes. And it had no flavour, if any flavour at all, at the end of the game. But I can always remember that quite a distinctive smell in the dressing room. But it was always the smell of liniment and Vaseline, and probably dubbing as well, because obviously in those days they used to dub in their boots to make them waterproof. But definitely, you know, the smells used to stay with me. Used to get in underneath. Mother would used to go in the boardroom, etc., with the other wives, and so I had quite a tour as a youngster. But I always remember the dressing rooms, the old style dressing rooms, and they were a little bit antiquated and dilapidated, but probably very little has changed since those days, to be honest.
Were you ever in there when the players or the managers were in there, or would you go sort of in there afterwards?
It was normally at the end of the game. Occasionally, I used to be brought up and watch them train, because they had no training facilities in those days, although they had the sort of kick-around area behind the back of the big bank. I can remember Mother bringing me up here and see them literally running over and jumping over benches. And they used to run around the sort of cinder track they had around here, and they used to train on the pitch, but not to the extent you'd expect them to, because obviously Sonny Clark, the groundsman, wouldn't permit them to, you know, carve up the turf, as it were. But I can always remember seeing them sort of running around, jogging up and down the side of the pitch. They always used to have sort of group sessions here, sat in the stand. Players would confer and they'd talk tactics, etc., etc. And then from here, I can always remember going straight across the road to the Georgian Dragon, and it would be in there for a swift pint, and they'd talk tactics, you know, and it was from here, there, bookmakers in Sybil Street, and I'd probably said before, then down to the old Greyhound, a bit further down for a steak and chips lunch. But always had a cigarette on the go, and that's one thing I always remember as well. A part of the dressing room scene was how many players smoked, and I think they did just to sort of calm their nerves before the start of the game, and they'd probably finish it off at half time, you know.
Do I remember you saying once that your dad used to have half a cigarette before?
Yeah, he always got very nervous before a game, and never ate before a game. He'd always have a piece of toast and maybe a cup of tea. He used to get dreadful butterflies in his stomach, and I'm sure he used to smoke on the way to the ground, walking up Prince Charles Road. And I know that he used to nip it and put it on top of the cistern in the toilet and then finish it at half time. You know, it was just the done thing, just to calm and soothe his nerves. But at home, he very rarely smoked cigarettes, but he always had a pipe on the go, always smoked a pipe, which in this day and age wouldn't be heard of. Although I know some of the guys do smoke in this day and age, it wasn't the done thing. Well, it isn't the done thing now, but in those days it was part and parcel of what they did, you know.
It's one of those changing things in football culture, isn't it? Interestingly, we're doing this project about the old grandstand, and this is something that doesn't appear to have changed a great deal. One would think that it's the same as it was when it was first built, but are there any ways that it's changed from how you remember?
It still needs a look of paint. You look at the old sort of roofing and the side supports and the glass. Probably some of the glass is still original or very, very old anyway. I can remember the old wooden seats. Still got wooden flooring here, and it brings back lots of happy memories. You know, it's part and parcel. It's the fabric of the football club, and it'd be very sad to see it go if and when it eventually does go. But looking at it, it certainly needs updating. I can always remember as well evening games. When I was up here, sat here with my grandfather, you used to see bats flying in the roof. You get birds on a Saturday afternoon or an afternoon kick-off game, but in the evening you'd get bats flying in the roof as well. You know, it was always quite noisy and lively up here. But my fondest recollection of the stand was just the atmosphere and the noise that was associated with it. Obviously lots of cheering, lots of stamping of the feet on the old wooden floors, and it was the only grandstand, it was the only seated area at the time. So if you had a little bit more money and could afford a seat, then obviously you had maybe a slightly better class of supporters sat here as opposed to the big bank or the cowshed.
So this was kind of, how you say, the posh part of it?
Very much so, yeah. You were privileged to sit in the grandstand, even in the mid to late 60s. You know, I couldn't afford a season ticket. My grandfather couldn't afford a season ticket. It seemed out of his price range, and by today's modern standards, it wouldn't appear to be a lot of money in those days. But I used to enjoy standing on the terraces, and what we used to do as youngsters, we'd all stand behind the goal that the City were attacking, and then you'd walk around behind the back of the cowshed and then go and stand at the opposite end, which, you know, everybody, all the kids used to do in Exeter. That's, you wanted to be at the end where they were likely to score goals. But yeah, the stand was a privileged area to sit in. I think it was, and it was only latterly in my days with when my grandfather was still alive, that we actually purchased season tickets, and it was the height of luxury to some degree.
That's fantastic. Can you remember any particular occasions where, I suppose, where it went off, where the atmosphere in this stand was particularly memorable?
I can remember one particular game when they played at home against Bury in the league one Saturday afternoon, and City were losing 2-0 at half time, and Fred Binney came out in the second half and he scored a hat-trick at St James End, and I can always, normally it's comebacks that sort of stick in the memory, and I can remember they beat, I think it was Barrow 7-1 or 7-0 at home here one Saturday afternoon, with the majority of the goals being scored in front of the big bank. And I think even fullback Dero Sesamive got in on the act, which was unheard of, fullback scoring goals in those days. But I can certainly remember that game against, I think it was Bury, and I'm sure Fred Binney scored a hat-trick on that occasion. And those are the sort of things and games that sort of stick in the memory. But again, the memory that I have sat in here, I was sat just a bit further along, and part of the goal was blocked by one of the stanchions here. And it was in the League Cup, and it was against Sheffield Wednesday, who were then a First Division team, and Mr. Springett in goal, England goalkeeper, and Dermot sort of chipped him or lobbed him from the edge of the 18-yard box, and City, I think they won 3-1 on that occasion. And my other abiding memory, being an ardent Manchester United fan, the City played the then European champions Man United on January the 4th, 1969, which I've never forgotten. And I stood on the big bank with my mother and my grandfather, and my grandfather had acquired an old orange crate, and I stood on the orange crate wearing my duffel coat. It was a winter's afternoon, and I can always remember it being very misty at this end of the ground, and Alan Banks scored the opening goal, and of course you then think European champions 1-0 down, we're in with a big chance here. But one of the abiding memories I have from that day, and I think there was in excess of 18,000 people, it was the biggest crowd I've ever been amongst here, was the line of red Devon General buses that seemed to run the whole length of Old Tiverton Road that were bringing the fans to the game. And that memory has always stuck with me of that particular match. And United played in blue that day, and obviously they were a little bit stronger and far superior in the second half, but again I saw my heroes. Dennis Law, Bobby Charlton and George Best, and special occasion. And out of all the games that I've witnessed up here in, the 50 plus years that I've been coming up here, that's probably my one abiding, that's my biggest memory of this ground and this grandstand and this football club, is the atmosphere on that day, because it has been replicated on a few occasions, but not in front of 18,000 people. And it was just great to be part of that atmosphere on that particular day, you know.
We don't have them very often, those big occasions, do we? But they are quite special. And
Yeah.
I experienced the Liverpool game, but what is it? I can't quite imagine 18,000 people in it. Can you kind of explain to me how that even happened?
Crammed in like sardines, you know, and in those days, I mentioned earlier to some of the guys here that the goal was much further back at St James End. It's only since the refurbishment of the big bank end that the ground's actually been moved. And when you look at the old concrete terracing and where the red barriers are now, that was where the goal was, basically. It was literally crammed right up. There was very little space behind the back of the goal. And I can always remember there was sort of 15, 20 minutes to go at the end of each game on a Saturday afternoon. They used to open the gates behind the goal. And if the City were having a bad day, you'd see all the fans flooding out before the finish of the game, you know. And but there again, it used to work the other way, because you used to get people walking up and down St James Road, and they used to walk into the ground to watch the end of the final 15 or 20 minutes, you know. So, but it was very cramped that particular day, and I've never experienced anything before, and I've never experienced anything since January the 4th, 1969, and it's obviously they were crammed in the cow shed, they were crammed on the big bank, minus the roof. Difficult to get to the toilet. If you wanted to go to the bathroom at half time, you just couldn't get to the toilets. It was, you were packed in really tight, it was cramped. Major safety issues, I would have thought, but we didn't care about that. We just came to see the City take on the might of Manchester United on the day, you know.
Brilliant. And that's like the high occasion. I'm kind of the sort of the more mundane stuff, but when you used to come here with your mum and you'd be in the director's box, can you sort of describe sort of the day, the route you take, and what that would be like.
You know, mum and dad have always lived in the same, since they got married, they always lived in the same house up in Chancellor's Way, Beacon Heath. And dad never drove, he's never sat behind the wheel in his life, so he would always walk to the games on a Saturday afternoon. Dad would never catch a bus, and when he left here, he very rarely came up to witness games. When he did bring me up, we'd always walk up Prince Charles Road. We'd come in the Kendal Gate off of Old Tiverton Road, and we'd always go and stand on the corner of the big banking. And he'd always wear a flat cap or a trilby hat. We were never on time. We were always late for kick-off. And, of course, the guys used to turn around and jeer him and take the mickey a little bit. But he always wanted to sort of blend into the background. Always paid at the turnstiles. And in those days, I think it was like sixpence, 6 old pennies for me to gain access. And obviously times have moved on, it's changed, but I still look around the ground now and I can still see old bits of corrugated iron and timber work and stanchions, especially the floodlight stanchions. The old wooden posts are still there, and of course they used to run out before the start of the game, and they didn't have their warm-ups in those days like they do now, but they used to come out maybe for 5-10 minutes just to kick a ball around, and they might put 1 or 2 lights on at either end, so there was a huge shadow cast across the pitch, and you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, and it was probably a question of saving money, saving finances by not turning the floodlight system on fully. It was a totally different era, but happy days.
Happy days. Do you have a particular, not happy day, happy period? Best period for this club that you enjoyed as a supporter?
Obviously, I remember promotion years. I remember vaguely the 63-64 season when Dad was involved as captain. I remember the Terry Cooper era. I mean, I can remember I used to bring Mother up. You get interested. There's a buzz in the city. We used to come up and stand on the big bank. And I remember a game they played against, I think it was Scarborough, towards the end of the season. And I think they had to win that game to gain promotion. And then I believe they played Southend United the following Tuesday night, or maybe the week after, and that was when they actually won the title. I think it was Southend United. I think they were vying for promotion at the same time as well. That was the title clincher. That was the first trophy that I'd ever known the city to win. The first piece of silverware in the cabinet that I'd ever witnessed up here.
Did they come up and celebrate in the old grandstand when they won that?
Yeah. I mean, obviously there was a massive pitch invasion, and I can always remember that after certain important games, the kids used to just pile onto the pitch. You were never stopped. It was never frowned upon. It was just part and parcel of what went on at the football club. And you see it now after big games, especially recently with the Leicester City getting promotion. And I think it's part of the fabric of the football club for the fans to come on and celebrate. And there's certain games that you recall. Normally it's victories and not defeats, but when I first started coming up on a regular basis, serious basis, 66, 67, the club was always languishing at the foot of Division 4, and they'd have to apply for re-election, and they'd never get above halfway, or never seem to get above halfway. But you had your heroes that played, and you didn't care so much about them losing 1-0 or 2-1 at home, as long as it was a good performance, it was an enjoyable game of football. And I can remember during the power crisis in 1973, I think the City were drawn away to Wolverhampton Wanderers in the Football League Cup. And because of the power crisis, the game had to be played. It was a midweek game, but it had to be played during daylight hours because they weren't allowed to switch on the floodlights because there was energy-saving measures enforced. And I think the City lost 5-1. And I was utterly and totally devastated. I remember I was at school and we were looking out for the result, and of course we didn't have access to social media, etc. in those days. And other games that sort of stick in the memory, I remember they played Rotherham United. They played them in the league. I've got to get this right because they played them either in the league on the Saturday. Yeah, it was the league on the Saturday, and the City went up there and won 4-0. And then they played them back there at Rotherham during the week, the following week, and they lost 4-0. And my first reaction was, well, surely they've got that wrong. The teleprinter's wrong, or surely they've not won 4-0 and then there's been a complete reversal and lost 4-0, but that was the case, and I was devastated by that. And it stuck with me for years. And, fond recollections and memories of coming to midweek games, especially on a Wednesday night, because you'd leave here, you'd go home, your mum would have a bowl of tomato soup and crumpets for you to eat to warm up, and then it was sports night with Coleman on a Wednesday night. And you'd watch the football highlights. And another recollection I have is, I can remember David Coleman saying after a game here, rushed home, parents, let your sons and daughters stay up tonight because you'll see a fantastic Georgie Best goal. And it was when he took it round, Ron Chopper Harris came in from behind, tried to scythe him down, and Bestie took it round the goalkeeper, Peter Bonetti, and slotted it in the net. And that's another memory. I can remember the game here, rushing home to see that, and Dad letting me stay up to watch that particular goal. And that was a regular thing. As a young fan, football was everything. You know, we lived for it. We wanted to play the game, but we also wanted to watch it. And match of the day was not to be missed on a Saturday night. You know.
What was it like being part of a football family as it was at Exeter City?
Dad was always visited by a lot of the players, and I suppose being captain at the time, they maybe sought advice, especially some of the younger players. Again, Mum and Dad never had a telephone, so the only way they could communicate really was he'd either come into town and meet them in the city, or out of season in the close season. Quite often they went and worked on the seafront at Exmouth, sweeping up sand, or they went lumberjacking up on Holden. So they always had it was a very close-knit community, but I can always remember many players that, I mean, most of the players lived in Exeter or thereabouts at the time, whereas in this day and age, a lot of them commute. So they'd always pop in for coffee and a chat, especially, as I say, in the close season. And he had quite a few. The club had club houses where they used to accommodate players in those days. Whether or not it was rent-free, I don't know, but they always seemed to find a house for them to live, and they'd move their families down if they were transferred from outside the city. But they were players of their day, but players of Exeter. They were part and parcel of the fabric of this city. I don't think you get that quite so much in this day and age, but you know, they couldn't walk down the town, down through the city centre without being stopped and approached by City fans. And I think that is slightly different in this day and age. And also after the game, they'd maybe associate a bit more with the fans. Not that I was a drinking man when I was a teenager, but they used to go into the local pubs and they discussed it. They'd obviously accept criticism from the fans, especially if they'd put up a bad performance and they'd lost at home. But you know, they obviously enjoyed a drink with the fans, and they used to chew the cud in the local pubs round and about. So.
And did they like that?
Yeah,
That part of it?
yeah, it was a community spirit, and I think maybe that's what the game lacks in this day and age. I'd like to see, I mean, nowadays you look at the Premier League and everything evolves around the Premier League. It's obviously slightly different in the lower divisions and at grassroots football, but they were the fabric of the city, and I've said it on so many occasions, they were working class heroes. But you could have a chat, a beer, and you could chew the cud, you could have a chat with them after and discuss, you know, the ins and outs of how they played and what they were trying to do, you know. And I know for a fact that when Dad wasn't playing, if he'd been dropped or if he was injured, we used to get the Express and Echo City final newspaper delivered on a Saturday afternoon. And that's where all the football results would come through, and you'd see all the divisions printed out. And that was the only thing on a Saturday afternoon after watching Eddie Waring commentate on the rugby league that he used to look forward to. He'd sit and watch the television with the ITV7 horse racing, etc., because like a lot of footballers, they were passionate about their horse racing. But he'd always look forward to the Express and Echo being pushed through the letterbox so he could chew the cud over the league positions and the results that day, you know. So it was a totally different era, and as I said earlier, he used to get very nervous, so he never used to eat before a game. But you know, aside from that, it was always fillet steak or T-bone steak and chips. That's what he lived on. You know, it was red meat.
Completely different.
Yeah,
Completely
definitely.
different. I think it's an example that we do a lot about the changing culture of football and why we do the heritage work, because it's not just about football, it's about how people lived and how people were in a community.
Yeah.
I wonder what your thoughts were on the heritage work, just personally in terms of your family's collection and in a wider sense.
I've been, it's opened my eyes to some degree, in that I wanted to get involved in some way or another. you know, my dad was my dad first and foremost, and you don't really appreciate what he meant or what he did until, you know, later in their life, or maybe when they've passed on. And I think what's been achieved here at the football club through the university and the good work that yourself and other members of the uni have put into it, it's nice to recollect. It's nice to collate information for future generations. And I think the work that's been done behind the scenes, which a lot of City fans probably don't realise and don't appreciate what's happening at the moment, it's nice to not only save it for future generations, but I've certainly learned an awful lot more about my father and my father's playing colleagues than I ever knew. I've gone through a lot of the archive, I've gone through newspaper cuttings, old photographs, and it means more to me now than it's ever done. And it's nice to know that working in conjunction with the city and through the trust and through the lottery funding that you've now achieved, it's great that this will be preserved for people to view and to hopefully come to the ground at some stage when maybe a museum's put in place for the youngsters of the city to try and understand what this football club and the players of the past mean to the city and the people of Exeter. And I've been very privileged to be part of that.
I couldn't have voted for a better answer. Do you think community is a massive part of Exeter City?
Oh, definitely. You know, as a youngster, I was a football fan, but I was also a sports fan. And it's great to see local teams like the Chiefs now are performing, you know, beyond belief in the city. And I think it's about time that more investment was brought to this football club. I'd like to see somebody come in from outside, and because it is definitely a centrepiece, it's a cultural part of the city and the fabric of the city, and I don't think that should ever be lost. And I think the work that you've been doing with the club can only benefit the football club. I hate to see clubs in decline. You've seen so many clubs over the years fall upon hard times. I mean, obviously the city have gone through that in the past as well, and now it's in the hands of the trust. The supporters own the football club, and that's, I think, the way to go. All the money seems to be at the top echelons of the game, and it'd be nice if some more of that TV money was filtered back into the lower divisions. And it's almost like, I think a lot of the clubs like the City and the teams in the lower 2, maybe 3 divisions have become feeder clubs for the bigger clubs, because I think there's still a lot of talent in the area. And I think that's a major part of the community aspect of this football club, is that there are young lads out there that have got ability, but it needs to be harnessed in the right way. And it's the future of the football club for me, because without these young lads coming through the ranks, which we've seen in the last 2 or 3 seasons, I know they move on for large amounts of money, but that's the survival of these smaller football clubs. And you know, I got quite passionate about watching the Salford City episodes on television, where the Man United, the class of '92, have been involved. And it'd be nice to think that something similar could happen here. I think with a bit more investment, it could certainly, the club would develop and thrive on that. You know, even if you've drifted away over the years and moved away from the area, you still look for the city's result on a Saturday afternoon or an evening. You know, I used to be passionate about it. It was my life. I knew nothing more, and this was my second home as a youngster growing up, and I didn't know any different. I wanted to be part of Exeter City Football Club, and of course you buy all the memorabilia, you wear the badges, the scarves, the hats, the rattles. It was a big part of my life growing up, and long may it continue.
Fantastic. A few questions just to wrap up with, and one's quite a big one, because I know you work very hard with, trying to work very hard with the dementia groups.
Yes.
And stuff like that. Do you see a role for heritage work within that? How memories can help?
I think so. I mean, obviously going through with Dad and his illness, his Alzheimer's, I know from some of the care homes that he was in Exeter that the managers got involved in the care centres. They actually produced a lot of laminated press cuttings which were posted up on his wall within his rooms within these care centres, and you could see, maybe although the information didn't sink in straight away, it obviously lit his imagination, and obviously there was something that sparked information within. And I think that, yeah, definitely working amongst I'm quite interested in that aspect with Alzheimer's and dementia, because there are so many different types of dementia, affects people in different ways. And I think a lot of these clients and patients, they can relive past memories. It's the immediate memory or conversation that they miss out on, but they can recollect lots more things from the past. It's a bit like music in some respects. They never seem to forget the words to favourite songs. And I think reliving their childhood or their teenage years, coming to the park, watching their heroes play on the park, I certainly think by maybe getting out in the community and visiting some of these people in their care homes and other establishments can only benefit them. And I know that when my dad was in some of his care homes in the area, I bought him an Exeter City training top and had his initials and his number put on. And you could almost see people trying to recollect and relate to what they maybe remembered from the past. They might have been ardent City fans from a younger age, and maybe they saw him play. And you could certainly see that spark. And I think it's certainly an interesting area and an interesting subject to delve into. And I think people that do suffer with various forms of dementia, it can only benefit them. And I think, I'm sure that it will stir some emotion and hopefully bring back recollections of times gone by.
Fantastic. A slightly easier one, or maybe not for you. Who's your favourite player?
Exeter City player? Well, that's difficult because I always had favourite players and favourite positions. Again, from different eras. Alan Banks has always been a dear friend. Jimmy Blaine, I always remember Jimmy Blaine because in the off-season, Jimmy Blaine used to drive an ice cream van, Mr. Softy. He always used to park outside Mum and Dad's house, and I'd run out and he'd let me have a free ice cream. You know? So I've always got fond memories and recollections of Jimmy flying down the wing as a left back, and dear old Alan, dear old Dermot Curtis. I always remember him scoring, you know, spectacular goals here. I mean, I remember one of my heroes was, I used to play at centre half at school, and one of my heroes was Jimmy Giles, and I worship the ground he stands on, and he's a character in himself, and, you know, a major part of this football club. And there again, the good friends of mine, Peter Hatch. And I always thought when Peter Hatch played well, the City played well. When he had a bad game, you knew the City had a bad game. But I've got no outstanding individual player, but I put players in, I'd pick my best players for each position. But I've seen so many great players up here, great strikers, Fred Binney, Alan Banks, Tony Callow. And dear old Keith Harvey, who came from Crediton, who signed a month after Dad joined, and made they played over 1,000 games for the club, and a major part of Exeter City Football Club. And I can always remember Keith, centre half, you know, day in, day out, game in, game out. You know, he'd turn up, and I know he suffered with broken legs, etc., etc. And I know Father made, you know, over 500 appearances to the club, but Keith was very, very close to his figures, and I don't think that will ever be witnessed here again. You get it maybe in some of the bigger Premier League clubs, you know, for example with Ryan Giggs, where he's grown up through the ranks. But I think at the bottom end of the football leagues, you don't get that quite so much in this day and age, because there don't seem to be many local lads that come through and stay, because obviously bigger clubs come in and they offer extortionate amounts of money, and good luck to them, because they've got to make a living, and you want to do better, you want to progress. Dad was very fond of the football club. I don't think he ever had any intentions of moving to Torquay or Plymouth. You know, I could say the same to some degree, but I mean, Dermot did, Alan Banks did. That they moved to other clubs, but they always came back, because this was their home, and it's always been a family-orientated club. And I think, and I can honestly say from the players that I've known and the players from the past that I've spoken to, that they've always got a fondness in their heart for Exeter City Football Club. And I'm sure they'd come back at the drop of a hat if there were reunions, etc., etc. And it'd be nice to see and think that a lot of the fans still remember these players from the past, because I certainly do. And it brings back, you know, many happy days spent up here, not only sat in the grandstand, but the majority of time stood on the terraces up here.
Fantastic. One final question, and this is the one that everyone struggled a bit with. In as short a way as you can, how would you describe Exeter City Football Club historically and from your own experience?
A centrepiece of the city of Exeter. You know, when the city went out of the Football League and went into the conference, that was disaster day for a lot of City fans and a lot of people of Exeter, because you'd never dream of the city losing their Football League status. It was a very dark day, and you know, it took them 5-6 years to regain their Football League status, but it wasn't the same when they went into the conference. And I know a lot of clubs struggle to get back into the Football League, but once you lose that status, although you're still part of the football family, you're not part of the 4 divisions, and that was a major issue, and I was broken-hearted. You think it's the end of the world. And I'm sure a lot of City fans, but there obviously then was successive promotions and the 2 trips to Wembley. That was one of the proudest days I've ever had in my life. I took my dad up to the first game, although they lost to Morecambe in the first game 2-1. When they played the national anthem, Dad burst into tears, because he never thought he'd ever witness Exeter City get into Wembley. And that was one of my proudest recollections of watching the city. Exeter City at Wembley, unheard of. You know, so maybe in some respects it was a good thing to happen that they went down. You know, they found their place in the football world, in the pyramid of the football leagues. But it's so much nicer to see them back in, although in the lower echelons of the Football League. I'm sure there are great times ahead, and long may it continue. The club can only go one way, and that's onwards and upwards.
Mm-hmm.